东北大法。这样那不是有时候，怎么嘛？比如就我那出吧，他这样就是养的很大点，他有些话嘞，他那有些的，滚到有把水下啊，滚到有把水下。他也就是说，你想的呢，看他看的一般呢，光正就之前开始是多啊，我可以拿了，滚到就到你的面色上啊，想完他也都看到，然后都看到。哦，他的这个民族，看到提前我老是提升了这个民族，你看他考的什么？他给一个多的工人拿了滚到月送下，最面色上，多的工人这把地拿了滚到面把水上，是看你都面色，面色，这样就多的工人拿了滚到月，滚到因为月被吃把面那样，滚到后来有点了，我的这个民族，这个，些本多的工把民族是，听对数工人厂的，其中没把中的他给得是。还是说呢，谈到第一，工人的这些些可以谈到比较可以拿了，就是他们做的，有啊嘞，从小生产的，但是呢，他没这的，多的工人拿了，就是他们做的没些，他没些自己提丢呢，爸爸他们提丢呢，出提前呢，就是他们做的没不空的电器，这些电呢，就是他们有事情是这样，开始去改装啊，这些。长沙当多年样改的是，长沙来就是他的工人的这些铁档比较破档，长沙的些档不一样改多的，多年些档不一样改，他多了现在看现在长沙的多年就告诉滚大和药的，他也不药的，他们都没那样，他也不药的，那突然滚大的点把你干了没事，你这长沙当多改了什么？是他改的。
So okay, so we've had a couple presentations why of course nominal things or constructs. Remember they said that in generally speaking constructs can be divided into those which refer to existing things and those which refer to things which don't exist. But generally speaking, you have to say that constructs do exist. Okay, so when the commentaries such as older commentaries on the sutra in which the Buddha explained the intent of his sutras, start explaining that, with regard to dependent things, the Buddha in this sutra said they are neither truth, right? They neither exist ultimately nor do they exist nominally. And then they went on to say again, there was another section that it said empty things, what do you call it, totality things, that they do exist nominally, but they don't exist ultimately, which is the opposite of what's correct. And on those 2 points, the great commentaries on the sutra in which the Buddha explains the intent of his sutras are wrong. Jasokapa, this is all in response to a claim that somebody has said, right, that constructs don't exist, right? People are claiming that somebody in the mind-only school might end up saying that constructs don't exist at all. Because not being in either one of the 2 truths, they would have to not exist at all. So, and then Jetsokapa says, those commentaries have been wrong on other points as well. It wasn't just on this point that they were wrong. For example, they say that things, what was it? They say that the mind-only school does say that external things exist, right? And we know, according to the presentation by in Tekdu, right, by Master Sangha, that they, in the compendium by Master Sangha, that he says they're distinctly quoting the original sutra that those things don't exist. This school says that external objects don't exist. So it's obvious that these commentaries have been wrong on those points, and they're probably wrong on the other points as well. And then to rub it in, Jetsokapa starts quoting also Master Sangha 2 different places. He quotes Bodhisattva levels, and then he quotes the abbreviation. And he says, in these 2 places as well, they describe constructs as being existing things. Admitted, there are certain constructs which don't refer to existing objects, but in general you have to say that all constructs do exist. And also admittedly they exist only nominally. But you still have to say that they exist. Okay, they may not exist ultimately, but they do exist nominally. Therefore, they exist. So, for all these reasons, for the reason that the original sutra indicated that constructs do exist, for the reason that Master Sangha's two 2 works, even 3 works, I'm sorry, Master Sangha on two different commentaries is saying that they do exist, that constructs do exist, even though they exist only nominally. Therefore, you cannot say that the intent of the sutras, right, was to say that constructs don't exist at all as a group. Now we have on the last line of page 50 and on the beginning line of page 51, some of the guys are coming up and saying, look, why are you complaining about the commentaries to the sutra in which the Buddha explained the intent of his other sutras? You know, why are you doing that? Why are you complaining about that? Everybody knows that it was written by Master Sangha himself. Okay, and Geshe-la points out that there are catalogs to the Tengyur in which the great commentary to the sutra in which the Buddha explained the intent of his other sutras is supposedly written by Master Sangha. It says in those, you know, I've also seen it. There's also some that say supposedly written by Master Sangha. But anyway, there are catalogs to the Tengyur where it says this book was written by Master Sangha. Then Jetsun Kappa says anyone who thinks, anyone who claims that this book, that these mistaken commentaries, or commentaries with mistakes in them, were written by Master Sangha, hasn't looked into the matter very well. Okay, matakso means, matapachembo means they have grossly failed to look into the matter at all. Page 51, first line. Why? For several reasons. First of all, what's stated in that great commentary to the sutra on the intent of the sutras, and what's stated in the Bodhisattva levels, and what's stated in the abbreviation are all at odds with each other. Okay, like if you set on one side this commentary to that sutra, and if you set on the other side these two known commentaries by Master Sangha, they seem to be completely saying different things. They seem to be totally contradicting each other. And like Master Sangha is not the kind of person to contradict himself in 3 different books. Okay, so that's one indication. Secondly, we find in that commentary on the sutras, right, on the intent of the sutras, we find a quotation. They quote Master Dharmakirti, who, by the way, Westerners say lived around 600, 700 A.D. Master Sangha is 350 A.D. So they said, that book quotes Master Dharmakirti, so even historically, the claim that book was written by Master Arya Sangha is wrong, from point of view of style. from point of view of content, from point of view of historical, possibility. He couldn't have written it. Anybody who says that hasn't looked into the matter. And then Geshe-la brings up another possible objection. Somebody might come and say, it's no problem that Master Sangha is contradicting himself here, because remember, like, he's really a Madhyamikan in mind-only clothing, sheep's clothing, like everybody knows he's really a Madhyamika thinker who's just presenting the mind-only school for his whole life, and then they say, well, even if he were, even if that may be the case, right? That could be the case, but in these 3 books, he's purporting to present the ideas of the mind-only school. He begins by saying, I'm going to present the ideas of the mind-only school. So it's not like he's going to throw in Madhyamika in some books where he's supposedly presenting only the mind-only school. So that's not a justification for why there might be some contradictions here. The fact is, he didn't write it because of the time is impossible, the subject matter is impossible, and the style is different also. That's all.
Tanti karasana papa thongmeji ze matse bade karasa papa thongmeji dode gondenji dejin sin surtu ze koya tsawani ni su ze koya ne bi gyuzen go shamde ne tan ngaptu ngaji ki yege inding ni ba tar kon duar gondenji lingshi lewu ma to ba lewu hama na pe mo chi tang sha kanen na te la pap tu pe loben di je ba surtu ze go ba ya minamo so te ba nasa ni karasana doa hava thome ki somshi doa si jora namadala doa ti na la dode konde ji leuchu na ne lingshi leuti su thang me dukse thang me duk ma to se leu kha ti hama to pe chwa thang su doe na sikora su thang ni ni di thön di ti na thak pen do kale khak po yo sai dode konde ji sik thön da del kale khak po yo sa bi se ko pe se abo chene de sha ni doa le lo su 나바텔라 도알레 로수 도데 고니지 디지스 수투 제코 소니 제가 도데 고니지 디지스 파와토니 마체바데 디솔라 테나 티나
Jetsukapa says, I'll give you another reason why Master Sangha never wrote that book, okay? He did write the book called The Abbreviation. In the book called The Abbreviation, that book treats the entire sutra on the intent of the sutras in great detail. Except for one chapter. There are 10 chapters in that sutra. One chapter is called the Lengshi means. Lengshi sort of means a story about how the book was written or why the book was written, or usually it's something like that. Okay. Nowadays it means the foreword of a book is called a Lengshi or a Lengja. So he says, aside from that chapter, which is not like the biggest chapter there. All other 9 chapters of the 10 chapters of the original sutra in which the Buddha explains the intent of the sutras, he covers every chapter. He pulls out quotations from each of those 9 chapters. He talks about them in detail, and in particular, he goes after difficult points in those chapters. So he rips apart. He goes in. He delves into them. So there's no need. There's no reason why Master Sangha would have gone and written another commentary on the same subject. You say. So you can't say that he wrote what's called the Great Commentary on the Sutra in which the Buddha explains the intent of the sutras, because he did write the abbreviation, which turns out to be a really big, long book about, in great detail about the contents of that sutra. So there's no reason why he would have finished that, and then started another commentary on the Sanjay, Okay, so it doesn't make sense. It doesn't come.
한디네 미나모 시간당 알지 깍지 지기 근데 니나 가서 송도 깜짝 타면내라 남이 지루야 타배 송도와 되나 인자 타면
라레 티
남이 눈이 세고 근데 알나
나서
한디 치지 한디네 미나모 다 인증 시바 나바테나 치지 가직장서 깜짝 아직 치지 가직장 원이 당보 타니도야 매 바바 바라바 타니도 여장 전담도 타만 되는다 바로 여봐 딘디지 이시 가지고 여기 땅 맞이 여기 뒤다고 나오지리 군다 대만이가 매세송아 제와 타니 요도 타니도 이제 전담도 요도 전담도 이제송 코다 잡고 제니 원이 당고 타니도 하면 군다 바르바 타니도 여장 전담도 매세 시마네 여기 코다 잡고 치면 타마 전담도 여봐 전담도 아래서 네 독신의 캐년 지에디 통메 꾸지기 공발레 진짜 통메 다 로베니 뭐 뛴자래 진짜 꾸지스 제 온도다 그 공발레 본인이 켈레리 호나니 대다가라 송그 아래 시에게 가지 독소 이 송바야 루 딜레 치로도 겨봐 일라세 셈잠빌루소 싸완이니 그신데 말에 이 개짜디 셈잠빌루소래 현도 심하지 셈잠 띵나게 개짜는 뛰어 치지 가지고 다기 되면 봐 현다지 여기 도대 공리지 지진세 비제 땡주나 비자고 봐 디시 샹라 미 현다지 치지 가지고 대신 부대 탐지 켐바입니다
맞아.
봐. 다 부대든지 전부 호랑이랑 줬다고는 당다 얘기가. 이나야 샘담배 딘데시. 니 가르세는 바바 통메다 로베 이니니기 샘담벨루소 권인이 켈리니 권인이를 다 오독신 세고도 군다 타니도 야미. 시와 타니도 여야 전담도. 너를 전담도 여어서 바바 통메다 로베 이니 송그 아래 송아. 오다 대지기면 있어.
맞아.
치지 가지고 때라 부대 탐지.
맞아. Now on page 51 on the 5th line, Chigikachi Kyang means, and also there have been later people who showed up later, later thinkers and later debaters have shown up later and made similar mistakes or similar claims, right? What are those claims? First one is that the first of the 3 attributes of the MindOnly school, right, which is constructs, that would come along and say that constructs exist neither ultimately nor do they exist relatively. They exist neither ultimately nor nominally, neither ultimately nor deceptively, which is in effect to say that they don't exist. Some people have come up and said that's what the MindOnly school thinks about constructs. When you get to the middle one, meaning the middle of the 3 attributes, which is shenwangs, right, dependent things, well, then they say, oh, they do exist nominally, but they don't exist ultimately, which is also a reversal, right? And then they come up to the last one, they say, which is totality or emptiness, and they say, it does exist ultimately, but that's all, okay? Then some people, these later debaters, have come along and said, this is the true intent of Tomekuchi. Tomekuchi means Asanga and the brother, meaning Asanga and his half-brother, Master Vasubandhu. Okay, so when they were in MindOnly school sheep's clothing, then that's what they believed and that's what they said. Now this is basically exactly the same positions that are being expressed by whoever wrote the commentary on the sutra, on the intent of the sutras. And so really it's just the same error over again. It's the same misreporting of the concepts or the positions of the MindOnly school. Who is it? Oh, and then he goes on to say, anyone who thinks that has dropped out of this system. Okay, there's an expression in Tibetan which is they have gone to the outside of the system, meaning they've lost the system. They've gone to somewhere else. Okay, they may have gone somewhere else, but they're not in the MindOnly system anymore. So whoever reports this as being the intention of the MindOnly school has in effect dropped out of the MindOnly system, the MindOnly school. Now, who are these later people that Jetsun Kappa is talking about? Geshe-la identifies them as Bhutan Tamje Khyamba Rinchen Dup, Bhutan Rinpoche, who was instrumental in, by the way, instrumental in designing the Kangyo, putting them together. Okay, and he was about a generation and a half before Jetsun Kappa. He is a renowned scholar of Madhyamika. He understood the Middle Way school very well. He wrote good books about it. His description of that is correct. When he got to the MindOnly school, when he got to reporting what the MindOnly school believed, he didn't describe it correctly. Okay, he didn't get it right, and he did, for example, say these 3 things that 2 of them are not correct about the MindOnly school. So that's who Jetsun Kappa is obliquely referring to. Okay. Geshe-la is looking for that quotation from Dharmakirti that shows up in that book, just to prove to you that it's there. Okay. In his free time.
전담도 요 말에 다 형한테 타니도 요는 유비 공으로 가르래 타니도 요당 가르래서 그 대응 거라 타니도 유비 디자인죠 거라 가르송 알았어는 오 타니도 유비 대 추비래 대라 짱가서 요바 신바 짬 인지 뭐고라 짱가 몇도 시에 되나니想了工地给他都已经模拟型的过的这一瞬间的工地设计说马上啥写吧隐形说他一个想去这他你都有的想工个有这样可了落出版这么几我呢他想了叫他搞搞的多我对那这了想了叫他搞搞的要嘛人给送的也送了他现在不是这样的
那是
叫他搞搞有这个落出版这么几我有我那个没事呢你那个开心的吧当送大山我妈妈当我的刚刚学多一点我太早你的这个编辑
Then Jetson Kappa lays a further fault on these guys. You know, he's rubbing it in even more. He says, by the way, what did you say again about dependent things? And they said, we said that the mind-only school says that dependent things don't exist ultimately, but do exist relatively, or do exist nominally. And then he says, and what did they mean when they said exist nominally? And he says, what they mean when they say exist nominally is that when you look at something like a vase, and if, what was it? If it appears to you to be, it appears to a mistaken state of mind that it is arising and stopping, but in truth it's not arising and stopping like that. Okay, so to a mistaken state of mind, it appears to be beginning and ending in a certain way, but that's not the way it's really ending and beginning. Now don't forget that this is exactly how the middle way school was describing the word deceptive in deceptive reality, and then don't forget that the mind-only school attacked them for saying that, you know, and saying that that was correct or something like that. So here we go, someone reporting the mind-only school as saying, you know, the reason why dependent things we can say that they exist nominally is that they exist. They are said to start and they are said to stop with regard to a mistaken state of mind. If the mind weren't mistaken, they wouldn't see it stopping and starting that way. Since it is starting, it seems to be starting and stopping that way to this state of mind, that's why we call it nominally existing. So they've totally introduced something that the mind-only school never ever said at all and would never ever accept. And they are aggravating their error. And Jetson Kappa says, look, you know, you're getting worse and worse, you know, okay? Listen.
초직네 된다 디게지 초직네 도대 공대 뇌된 인스 뇌된 또 인스 오케제 티셔서 그 베티 간도 뭐마차 한디 가르 단계에서는 그들이 뭐지 된다 송당 대당 그게 전황 매장 제 더비 송다 그다 네 매번 샤와 타니도 요아르 된다 요로 된다 요아르 송다 다 대송게 요나 초직네 그게 전황 매 도대 공대도 뇌든지 도래 뇌든지 송래 시켜 뇌든지 송에는 다 지시만 캐는 도대 공대 나는 군다 유스 샤왕 전담도 유스 그러나도 군다 샤왕 전담도 타니도 유나 전담도 어떻게 빵하고 매배 가왕 같이 맞아 어떻게 대군지 전환 거다 여기 부대리지 또 송에 대당 잡아지 군지 전환 매자 셈 대중 아 도대 공대 뇌든 인슬라 개체 디시는 디니까 안
So now they go on to say, well, how do you establish that nominally existing thing again, right? They say Shenwangs are nominally existing but not ultimately existing. They report the mind-only school as saying that. Who's they, Buddha Rinpoche, so far, okay? And they're saying, changing things or dependent things do exist, they do exist nominally but don't exist ultimately, okay? And what do you mean when you say nominally? Nominally means they appear to start and to stop to a mistaken state of mind, but in actuality, they do not have any such starting or stopping. So then Jetson Kappa jumps on these guys and says, hey, wait a minute, you just did a kundam, okay? You just You just, you accused us of doing that, but now you yourselves are canceling Shenwangs, right? Shenwangs really do exist, and now you're saying that the MindOnly school says they don't exist. So you just did one of those tricks where you say that something that really does exist doesn't exist. You're discounting, aren't you? First you accused the poor middle way school guys of discounting. Now here you are doing it yourself. According to you, then the MindOnly guys themselves would be the ultimate discounters, because they'd be saying it's only to a mistaken state of mind that the stopping and the starting of things begins. And if the mind ever straightened out, it realized that those things don't stop and don't start, meaning that they're not dependent things, they're not cause things, and then they'd be canceling the very basis on which we establish constructs and emptiness. So if you want to choose anybody to be a discounter, right, someone who's discounting improperly, it's you guys when you're reporting the MindOnly school's beliefs. Then Jetsun Kappa goes on to another complaint. He says, by the way, and on this complaint, he's lumping in the Jonamba with Buddha Rinpoche, because on this point, Jonamba holds a very similar position to Buddha Rinpoche. So whatever Buddha Rinpoche has said here, Jonamba is very close to that. Okay, and what is his complaint to both of them? He says, by the way, and you, Jonamba, right? Weren't you the one who said that the third turn of the wheel, right? The sutra in which the Buddha explains the intent of his other sutras is ngedun, right? Is to be taken literally, right? Didn't you say that? And he says, oh yeah, I did say that. He says, oh yeah, doesn't that sutra say that constructs do exist? And doesn't it further say that changing things do exist by definition? And it never said they exist just nominally or something like that. Doesn't it say that? And he says, oh yeah, it does say those two things. Constructs do exist, and changing things do exist by definition, and not just nominally, right? It says that. The sutra says that. Aren't you the guy who said we had to take that literally? He says, oh yeah, I did. He says, here, like, there's even a bigger error, You've got even a bigger contradiction in your own system than before. Because on the one hand, you say that we have to take this sutra literally, and then when it says that, then that sutra goes ahead and says literally that constructs do exist, and that they're not such that they don't exist, right? By the way, why did they say they didn't exist? They said, with regard to both truths, neither truth applies to constructs. So you've got that problem. Now you've got the second problem. You're misreporting everything, and you've got a bigger contradiction than you ever started out with. No, sir. No, sir. Turn the film forward. Okay. Advance the roll. That's what he's trying to say. Advance the roll, and we'll go on to the next. We're on to another big section now. We're moving on to a separate section. Second line from the bottom, page 51. We've reached a section called, refuting attempts to show that our own system has contradictions, is contradictory. Now, who is refuting what? Don't forget that the whole exchange started out by the MindOnly school criticizing the middle way school. And then the middle way school criticized them back. They gave a counterattack. They said, hey, wait a minute, your own school has these other problems, your own presentation has all these other problems. Now you get the MindOnly school coming back again and defending themselves against the counterattack of the middle way school. Okay, so now they get to come back and say, no, our school doesn't have those problems, our school doesn't have those inconsistencies. Okay, this is going to be that section. Second line from the bottom, page 51. Geshe is referring back to the quotation at to the comment on the last line of page 50 where it says, anyway, the book quotes Dharmakirti in his book called It's called Pramana Samuchaya, the Samuchaya, or Vinishchaya, which means the distinction between these two things. So he says, he quotes that book where Dharmakirti is making distinctions. It's called Making Distinctions. So how could he have done that? And Geshe-la says, well, for one thing, they are separated by many generations. He says, I don't have the exact dates or anything like that, but by the time that Dharmakirti, when Master Sangha was writing his book, or supposedly writing this book, Dharmakirti still hadn't shown up in his mommy's tummy yet. So how could he be quoting Master Dharmakirti if they're separated by many generations of time? Secondly, I was hoping to find that actual quotation and share it with you, but I'm having trouble finding it right now, and I'll try to pull it out this evening and try to give it to you tomorrow. Okay, that's what
kati chansa dang duwa le xiawang xiong dambar yobar sumba sumba tar ina chansa dang duwa nangla ta semdang lura xiawang tiong dam du yu sung ya xiawang tiong dam du yu pa kwa la me pa jing song na wudip cha ruwa tayi dama yinba zada xiawang tiong dam du yu gen cha ruwa ta xiawang tiong dam du yu se na ta semdambi shung kaxie nala xiawang tiongdam du me se mang bu xi nga long tang yong se ta kiro kari du duwa se sungpa tar ina gongzhen le se dode gongzhen nangla dili sung xa se chidara pabi lam yana jeba dali du suma chikyo wa penzi tenyi tadeba yinba te shingdu kati che tadaki ti shingi tiongdamba yang tenyi tadeba yinba yunani tena tinyi tiongdaba xe taba yuro yule duwa ni ina duje yinba yuro duje ina ni tiongdamba yinba minjuro ta diri ta nenga lo duje ina tiongdamba yinba minjuro fongduwa duje ina tiongdamba yinba minjuro se duwa o di chik
Original chiki.
Nana silap jiang roya sara. At kyo mindo kyo mindo. DJ ina tenda ba yimba minjuro se chik de kyo de cha ba re. Kyo chik de. Ta kyo chik da ali xie. Ali lungde tenda ba li ga le xie.
Umabe palang you know.
Ta uma para inji mare. Ara sara mi kha xie sem da ba kyo si do. Sena chi da pe ji na la. Chi la re. No la ke mi chi ye ke mi cha ba. Dide ka ko na xie on de ta. Mi kha xie dide se chu na ma le di chang gi. Si ye mo su me na. Dide lap chu na ma le di chang gi. Si ye che ni. Chong ma mo ma ko me na ya. Khong ne lang ba khong ne me na. Ju ma lam ye chu na ma le di chang gi.
Na so.
Dide me ba ya. Ina ta de la wo tu ta. Kyo chi. 아, 다 디샴데는 의달래서 저다 또 가서 담비 되는 찍고 전담도 여바세요. 제 숨기나는 찍만도 매소. 찍 이 제바 나라에서 다 등이 찍고 제바고 찍바차. 양들래 전에 뭐니 찍고를 바차오. 전담비 덴반이 용수 주고 뭐니 찍고를 바차오. 숨차. 봐. 내시에다. 단 도디게 나라에 들이 다샴데니 유미미미 제가 지미 처음에 넘버 타주 되는 전담 센스 전담 세 콜라 예메 지예메 소아레스 다디 시바지 시자
나네
어 테닝가도 시아바양 무슨 시아바양 은 군다도 시원기 팀이 유바미 용도 팀 도알레장 샴드네 야직도 내군도 이거 지금 매와 제시 단위 뒤에 저 디샴도 도안을 지시 아치 다들 공도 마소나 아창네 내네 다 눈이 전다 또 갈리가 시해주래 또 무슨 눈아 창네 아니 너데 공 자기 저랑도 얘기 시왕 전담도 유시 다 샘답이 중 카시에 나라 다 중아부티 나라 시왕 전담도 몇 번 시해서 다 간두도 와
now the first part of this section is going to be the actual arguments posed by the non-mind only. So I said, oh, Geshe-la, you're talking about the Madhyamika school is doing their counterattack. He says, hey, it doesn't have to be the Madhyamika school, okay? It could be anybody. And he says, usually they don't even bother to identify who it is. It's just a generic complaint about the mind-only school, okay? It doesn't matter. We don't have to really identify who it is. It could be different people, but they're all going to be attacking the mind-only school and saying, hey, your own presentation has these holes in it. And I can show you why your own presentation has contradictions in it. So they don't really go into identifying who it is. It's just somebody trying to demonstrate to the mind-only school. It's not necessarily a direct counterattack. It's certain groups are coming to the mind-only school and saying, you know, your presentation has its own contradictions, your presentation has its own problems. Who is that, and what? They're going to use books of the mind-only school to blow holes in the mind-only school, okay? So they're going to use 5 different references. You know, we're going to go through in detail 5 different references that are used as ammunition against the mind-only school's own presentation. What's the first one? They're going to quote the sutra in which the Buddha explained the intent of his sutras itself. Okay, that's going to be the first one. The second one is going to be called Madhyanta Vibhanga, and it's the distinction between the extremes and middle and the extremes. I think it's a book by Master Sangha. Then you're going to, and Maitreya. And then you're going to get a book called Dodegyan, which is Sutra Alamkara, which is called the Jewel of the Sutras or something like that. Oh, by the way, in between there you're going to get as well a commentary on separating the middle from the extremes. Okay, so now you've got 4, right? You've got the original sutra, separating the middle from the extremes, a commentary on separating the middle from the extremes. Then you're going to have Sutra Alamkara, the Jewel of the Sutras. And then finally, you're going to get another quotation from the abbreviation itself. So you're going to have 5 different quotations that blow holes, particularly in the idea that the mind-only school says that changing things or dependent things exist ultimately. Because all of those 5 references, in some way or another, are going to be concentrating on the idea that they don't exist ultimately. Okay, they're going to be, these are mind-only books, these are mind-only references, and in each of these references you can find statements to the effect that dependent things do not exist ultimately. So who's right, and is there a contradiction here or not? So here begins the attack on the mind-only school. That's me. Nasam.
Chidara Pabi Gongde Les, Dodo Gondi Lung di Tan. Chidara Pabi Lamiala, Jeba Pensi Tini Tateba in Batishan to Copper Chiksha. Karasunga Sena, Palamiala, yes, Jorwa. Palamiala, Yepoti, Palamia, the Casante, Chanjo Subtin Nala, Namatawate. Chanjo Subtin about Ponga, Kam, is mine, and my Palamiala, yes, Masona, Sopachilla. Oh, Kososia, Palamiala, Yepo, Nang Penzi, Tade, Penzi, Gigi, Paku, Cabara Yuba, Nang Penzi, Tade to us. Key invitation rules. How could you think Tony is your? Oh, the Bena Palamiala, Yepocola, and Palamiala, Yepo, non pensi, Gigi, non pensi, Kaka, Rela, Julia, Yida, take Yeva, non pensi, Tade down. Julia gave an invitation to see. Could you think Tony in the Yorba? Cosoya, Julia gave a pensi, Tade Bashana, Tade Bashana. Palamiala, Pensi Teni Tadeba, invitation to Katichu to the Tishini, turned up a shoulder down, Mabayang, Sigur Buchabra, could you think Teni Tadeba, Invituna, non Pensi Teni Tadeba, or to send it to Gilly Kieva today, Yena, Tishini turned up a shoulder down, Mabayang, Yandico Tony Corani, Tina, Gule Kieva,
Lani,
Gule Kieva. Gule Juaninan. Duje Chasu.
Nani.
Duje in any Tandam Demba Maimba Juro, Tandam Demba Sigo. Turn Tamba Imba Minjuros, Tandam Demba Sunday. Duje in Tandama Imba Minjurus, Tamba Yuaris, Chick did that. She Duje in a Tandam Mimba Sunda.
This is pretty cool. They're quoting the sutra on the intent of the sutras. And that sutra is examining the nature of the 8 components of the Arya path. Okay, this is one of the 37 elements of enlightenment that we talked about before. We had all these different groups, and finally we said, this is the final one actually, the 8 components of the Arya path. Okay, and when they got to the 8 components of the Arya path, that sutra says, by the way, look at these 8 components. They are separate things. They are discrete things from each other. A. B. They are all coming from their causes and conditions. Okay, they grow from their causes and conditions. Okay, now consider the emptiness or the Yongdrup, right? The totality of those 8 things. Those totalities also, or those emptinesses that pertain to each separate one, are in themselves also separate. Okay, they are discrete one from another. and in that way they resemble the 8 elements. But if you were to go further and to say that those 8 emptinesses also grow from their causes and conditions, okay, then you would be saying that those things are produced, that those 8 emptinesses are produced things, right? If you said that they are produced from causes, that they have their own causes and conditions, as do the things which they refer to, okay? And in that case, you would have to be saying that they were not something that existed ultimately, because everybody knows that if something is produced, it cannot exist ultimately. End quotation from the sutra. Okay. What has the sutra just said? The sutra has just said, if they happened to be produced things, then they couldn't exist ultimately. And Jetsun Kappa rubs it in and says, aha, this sutra now is saying, if you're a produced thing, you cannot exist ultimately. And it's using that as a proof of why those 8 emptinesses can't be changing things or can't be produced things. Okay, so there's one example where your own school, there's something in sutra which is contradicting your own school. The sutra which you guys love to use turns around on you and says, if you're a produced thing, you can't be ultimate. Okay, you can't be existing ultimately. Okay, nothing. So to summarize the problem here, or the issue here, Jetsun Kappa is pointing out that according to that sutra itself, once something is a produced thing, it cannot be existing ultimately, says the sutra. And there's another quotation from Maitreya's own, our protector Maitreya's own book called, Dividing or Distinguishing the Middle from the Extremes, right? And in that book there's a line that says, the ultimate one is only one. Okay? The ultimate one is only one. And that quotation is referring to the 3 attributes of the mind-only school, and saying that only 1 out of 3, if we take it literally, okay, apparently it's saying that out of those 3 attributes or categories, only 1 of them is ultimate. And the commentary to that text further says, no, we didn't get to it yet. Listen. So if you take these words on their face value, they seem to be saying only Yongdrup, only totality or emptiness is something which exists ultimately. And the implication there is that the other 2 don't exist ultimately, and meaning that dependent things don't exist ultimately, according to this quotation, if you take it on face value. And the commentary to that text, the commentary to the text called Dividing the Distinguishing the Middle from the Extremes, right? The commentary itself also says, by the way, what this short phrase means in the root text is that the only thing that exists ultimately is totality or emptiness, and you should understand that that's the only one that exists ultimately. Okay, that truly exists ultimately. Okay, you should realize that that's the case. Okay? That's what. So really, what the commentary says about the root text and what the root text seems to say by itself are exactly the same. Yes, sir.
yule kieba yoba mai o chi da thandam demba sia kola yule thandam sia kola yule kieba yoba mai sile ele bi onde sa thandam sia kola yule kieba yo mare su di xiang go thandam gala ba thandam du me pa tra to cha
and then we're going to get a quotation from the Jewel of the Sutras, right? And it's going to start out by saying, it is not something which exists. Now, what does "it is not something which exists" means? What they're saying is that once, and by the way, the real commentary on these words is going to come later. You know, it's a very, very difficult word by itself. All it says here is that it is not something which exists. What that means is that what they're going to gloss it as meaning later is that once something comes from its causes and conditions, it cannot be included among ultimate things. Okay? Once something comes from causes and conditions, it cannot be included among ultimate things, is what the Jewel of the Sutras means when it says, it is not something which exists. Okay? Nothing. Listen.
You mean say what? You mean say. You mean say kasan yaga tondam demba yaga training ade chi le yon ko da travel is you mean citizen pena badam meeting yon ni mo te ni you mean citizen mo yo tan chi chu me ki chi tu yo pa
mayin
me mean citizen mo ta de tu ma so mo chi tu me pa mai means mo chi ta ya ko mo chi tu me pa mai ni mo chi mo chi badam meeting yon 인자 제 유민스들다 혼이 뭐데 타데 요한산 치규메게 타데티 아니
마인
메파티 아주 요파티
마인
찍도 요파티 메 민스들다 오 찍도 메파 마인
나서
이민 대신 민스들다 혼이 뭐데 요파당 오 찍도 요파파당 타 요한산 치규메게 찍 많이 바꿔 괜히 시험 바꿔야 많이
나서
다시 시험 되니 디세야부터와 이미미 디시미시미 깨다 지미 주와 민주때 지도다 담담세야 거라 깨와요 말이야 지과요 오 깨다 지미 지니 주와 수도 마 딥드라이 페나 마라도 로디 마마 가라 법좀 누구 체드자 마마마 딥드라이로 호나 신신 페나 딥잖아 코 마마 딥이온데 아니 그이땡게 돈이 고 마마 딥이에요 깨다 지와
나서
텔로하면 가라도 법좀 야 샘도 법좀 야야 차차차 친친치 그이땡게 돈이 야 차차차 진짜야 매
나서
텔로하면 진 나바타바미 나바타 규테네 담세스 담세요 콜라오 진짜지 거래 아 디네 내서 가면 끼워메 지바메 대세송아
나네
되네 끼워다 지바메 그냥 콜라 담세요 콜라 끼워다 지바메 시티 샤와라 끼워다 지바고 요 담담 인생 나서 내가 티가
Geshe-la says, oh, what the heck, let's go in and explain each syllable of this extremely difficult quotation, okay? Now, when it says, it starts out by saying, it's not something which exists, it's not something which doesn't exist, okay? We're referring to the ultimate, okay, to ultimate things. Whatever it means to be ultimate is what they're talking about. Now, you can refer back to those 5 attributes of Yongdrup, or totality, that we had before. These are very, very similar, okay? We had them back up there a ways, okay? And they were talking about, the first one, Yue means, is it the case that, for example, a water pitcher and the emptiness which pertains to that water pitcher are one and the same? You know, are they like inseparable? Are they just simply one object? Are the water pitcher and the emptiness that the water pitcher exhibits, are they one and the same thing? No, they are separate. So you cannot say they exist as one and the same thing. And that's what it means when the quotation says they do not exist. They are not something which exists, meaning they are not something which exists as one and the same thing. A water pitcher and the emptiness which pertains to it, those two things are not something which exists as one thing, okay, as a single object. Next it says meimin, which means neither are they something that doesn't exist. This means neither are they something that doesn't exist with a relationship of what we call one identity, or something like that. A single relationship of identity. What that means, that kind of relationship means that if you remove one, the other is automatically removed. Okay, you can call it one identity or something like that. neither is it the case that they do not share a relationship of identity, meaning if you do remove a vase from the universe, you do remove all the emptinesses of vases from the universe. If there were no vases, there would be no emptinesses of vases. So although they are not one object, and although they are separate things, they do have such a relationship such that if you removed one, you would remove the other. Okay, so they do have an essential relationship. So it's not the case that they exist as separate things, and neither it is the case that they do not exist as things which are almost inseparably related. Okay, then it says Deshin Min Shen Min, meaning and by the same token, neither are they something other or something. Neither are they something both or something other. Okay, neither are they something unrelated to those two things. Okay, that's not the case either. So they neither exist, they neither not exist, nor do they both exist and not exist. Neither do they neither exist nor not exist. Okay, none of those is the case. Now, still talking about ultimate objects. Okay, it's still talking about what is ultimate. Okay, it is not something which starts. It is not something which stops. Okay, it is not something which can be, which has any beginning, and it is not something which stops. Okay, which perishes. Okay, now. This is the crucial phrase right here where it says it doesn't start and it doesn't stop, okay? This is the crucial phrase because now we're eliminating the description ultimate with regard to produced things, meaning shenwangs, meaning dependent things, right? So once you start saying that, hey, if a thing is ultimate, it cannot start and it cannot stop, you're already eliminating shenwangs, right? Okay, according to the mind-only school. Then it says there's no lessening and there is no increasing. Okay, and Geshe-la explains it very nice. You know, these are famous words from the Heart Sutra also. And what it means is, for example, when you start studying more and more, and your level of knowledge and your level of understanding gets greater and greater, or if you study less and less and your level of understanding starts to degenerate, right, and your knowledge starts to degenerate. When the knowledge starts to degenerate, does the emptiness which pertains to that knowledge in any way degenerate? Does it in any way lessen or become 30% or 20%? You know, something like that. No, it does not. Okay, it's still perfect 100% emptiness. Okay, so in that sense, the ultimate is without lessening, and the opposite is true. The converse is the opposite is true as well. When your knowledge or when your level of learning gets higher and higher and higher, is it the case that the emptiness of that level of learning gets higher and higher? No. It's always either empty or not empty. It's not either. It's not less empty or more empty. Okay, and that's another description of the nature of the ultimate. So now and then they say, and that's what the nature of the ultimate is. That's what ultimate means. So there's that long explanation from the jewel of the sutras, wherein they're explaining that things that are described as ultimate cannot be all of those things. And in there is a statement that there cannot be things that begin and things that end, which automatically disqualifies shenwangs. So there's another problem with your presentation, you mind-only guys. Okay? That's okay. 맞아.
두알에 장 유전 코드도 여버 줘봐 장 변담바 여버 제시 줘봐 자시나 매바 코드도 여버 줘봐 저거 되래 네 가르쳐는 유전 시에버도 시원 유전 수도 가르치기 알았으나 제비 민샤다 제 유전 수도 제비 민샤
맞아.
제불 유전세 가르쳐나 유다 댕게 인자네 유 테마다 된다
맞아.
제부터 뭐 강가로 제부 제대야 와 유야래 제부야래 가세요 거기서 자도 유전세 시원
맞아.
다 콜라 판이 좋아지 지니 유전세 시도 시원한테 군주도 요아래 단담도 요아래 수도 군주도 요버 줘봐 차오스 랭큐 아스 예리 인디다 유전세 군주도 시원한테 군주도 두고 단담도 두고 스케치 지원데 군주도 요스 랭치 잡도 와 두에나 찍게지 한 넘버 또 봐. 넘버 또 봐. 이거를 또 봐. 또 봐. 지버티를 지와 보라. 군속도 요아래. 군속도 여봐 줘봐. 참 대단한 여봐 줘봐. 자시나 군속도 여봐 줘봐. 자오. 본인이가로 군속도 전담도 요아래. 군속도 요아래 스케치 군속도 요시네. 군도 와. 아또 전담도 요산 숨미도 와. 제다티니 전담도 조산 미도 와.
Listen. This is pretty cool. Now we're on to page 53, second line. It says, moreover, the abbreviation says, okay, and then it says, gyuten kunzoptu yopa. Now we have to talk about the word gyuten. Normally gyuten means reason or justification or something like that, okay? And Geshe-la glosses it in a wholly different way. He says, gyuten means, refers to results, okay? Those things which exhibit a characteristic of possessing a cause. Okay, so he's taking gyu and sen, okay? Those things which show or indicate having causeness, okay? Which refers to what? Which refers to results. And what does your classic result belong to? What group? Dependent things, shenwang things. So gyutsen here is a code word for dependent things, okay? And then the book says, kunzo tu yupa jupa chashina, which is where the abbreviation, in the abbreviation there's a rhetorical question, you know. Hey, let's talk about shenwangs, let's talk about dependent things, you know. Are they something that exists deceptively, or are they something that exists ultimately? And then dua itself, the abbreviation itself answers, they are something which exists deceptively, okay? So there you go, MindOnly School. Now you got this other problem to deal with. Moreover, the same book later on says constructs are also something that exists. You know, it asks the same rhetorical question. Are concepts something that exists deceptively, or are concepts something that exists ultimately? And it answers its own question saying, concepts are something that exists deceptively. So here you go again, you have a problem. Okay? I'm sorry, I blew that one, okay? Concepts, the abbreviation says, concepts are something which does exist ultimately, and don't exist deceptively. Yeah, okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Let's start that again. Dua se adi shenwang dato kunzop tu yuna, dundan tu yuna, kech tu digala, kunzop tu yus. Nari. Dundan tu yus gyabim duas. Yina yan di. Nari. Ani sham ne le number to pa yang. Listen. Okay, I blew that. Erase that whole last section, okay? It doesn't say constructs, it says constructing state of mind, okay? So sorry about that. So then the abbreviation comes up and says, okay, having said that about dependent things in general, let's talk about the constructing state of mind, okay? Is the constructing state of mind something that exists deceptively, or is it something that exists ultimately? And the answer is, it exists deceptively, okay? Dua's own answer, the abbreviation's own answer is, it exists deceptively. So here in two cases, one in the general category of dependent things, and secondly, in a state of mind which belongs to that category of all dependent things, the same answer has come up. So these other guys, whoever they are, who are attacking the MindOnly at this moment, are saying, hey guys, you know, they didn't say in there it was ultimate, right? They asked a rhetorical question, and nobody answered those two things were ultimate, so I think your presentation's wrong, okay? That's another example of how their presentation is wrong. It looks like he's jumping to the defense of the MindOnly School, okay? He says, The question so far posed by these other guys, right, which ends on line 7, page 53. The other guys are saying, well, could you explain to me why this is not a contradiction? You know, everything you've said before about all these shenwangs, all these dependent things being something that existed by ultimately, and now all of these references saying they don't exist ultimately, okay? Then can you explain to me, can you explain this apparent contradiction to me or not? And then Jetokapa jumps in and says, on line 7, page 53, he says, hey, I can help you out. I can explain why there's no contradiction here, okay? And he seems to be jumping to the defense so far, okay? What does he say? He says, hey, guys, you got to realize one thing. When you say something exists ultimately, or when you say something exists deceptively, there are two different interpretations of what that means. Okay, there are two different ways of describing what it means when we say this exists ultimately or this exists deceptively. There are two different ways to explain that. Nothing. Nothing.
He on the shop on my bar, and the thing you will turn over your bar, it is a Open Tava, some to your Pola, come to your bar, I did there, come to your Chimara. Open Tava, top of Joe, Open Tava, some my bar, you running when it to Cantella, turn them to your bar, neither from what to say. There were tiny only shabby your bar, tiny your bar, Open Tava, some to your Pola, time, come to your tiny he only shop on me, but the top at 1,000 my imba, you run the 2 money to have one, turn them to you. That take us a joke to town be one. Nothing.
So there are two ways of describing what these two expressions mean. First, I'll give you the way that the first way describes both of them, and I'll show you the way that the second way describes both of them. Okay, so the first way of describing both of these two expressions is the meaning of something existing deceptively is that it is only a construct. It is only something which is a creation of our imagination or of our projections. Okay, it's something that our mind is constructing in a way, and that's what it means for something to exist only nominally or only deceptively here. So when we say in the first way of explaining the expression, this thing only exists deceptively, is to say this thing is only a creation of your projections. Okay, that's the first way of explaining it. And then when you go on in the first method of explaining to what is the meaning of something existing ultimately, you just turn it around. Okay, it is not something that only exists by virtue of our projections or our labeling. Okay, rather it exists from its own side through its own unique way of being. And that's the first way of describing those two expressions. What two expressions? To exist deceptively and to exist ultimately. In Jetsokapa's defense of the mind only, okay? Then Jetsukapa says, by the way, this is very similar to the presentation we had above of the middle turning of the wheel. Remember, in the middle turning of the wheel, Lord Buddha said nothing exists by definition, right? And then in the third turning of the wheel, they go into the middle turning of the wheel, and they start to divide, oh, he really meant it about that, and he didn't really mean it about that, okay? They start saying, with regard to, for example, dependent things or changing things, when Lord Buddha said they didn't exist by definition, he meant they really did exist by definition. He wasn't saying that, okay? When he said everything is just a projection, or everything is just a creation of your mind, he was not talking about changing things at that point. So remember back when we had that argument where the mind-only school was trying to distinguish between the things that Lord Buddha really meant it when he said it, and the things where he didn't really mean it when he said it. So in one case, when he didn't mean it is with changing things. He didn't mean to say about changing things that they didn't exist by definition. Okay? He didn't mean to say about changing things that they were just a creation of your projections. Okay? So we made that distinction back before. When did he mean to say it? Oh, when he got onto constructs. Okay? That's the third turning of the wheel's take on what he meant during the second turning of the wheel when he said, oh, things do exist. Constructs, on the other hand, don't exist by definition, and they are only constructs of your mind or only projections of your mind. So it was back in our presentation of the middle turning of the wheel as it is interpreted by the third turning of the wheel, where we began to make this distinction between something existing just only as a projection of the mind, and then something existing not just as a projection of the mind, but from its own unique way of being, or by definition. Okay? Same distinction was made there. That's okay.
랑 이거 들루지 투모마이 들루면 주바 말에 있어. 그냥 다 봤어야 돼. 투모마이 들루면 주바 말에 있어. 군다로 송 말에 시켜야 송. 오, 다디 간제 콜로 밥에 송 받고 된다 디 값이 군족 되라 송 거야. 또배 따봐 잠이 전담도 매 시도와. 디 전담당 군족 시에 잡고 야게 라비에 돼. 군다 또배 따봐 잠이 랑 투모마이 들루면 마주 나와. 코다 콜로 밥에 송 많이 전담도 찍기 간다.
So remember we said we were going to have two interpretations of what the words exist deceptively and exist ultimately means, and here we're in the first version of what it means. And they say, you know, if you want to appreciate this presentation of what it means to exist ultimately and what it means to exist deceptively, you have to go back to the second turning of the wheel. Okay, dole here, 5 lines from the bottom on page 53 means from the middle turning of the wheel, from the sutras in which the middle of the turning of the wheel was done. You know, the sutra said nothing exists by definition. And then the mind-only school went back to that sutra and said, hey, it was talking about only constructs. Okay, it's only about constructs that middle turning of the wheel was speaking literally. Okay, so when it went into the meaning of not existing by definition, it was referring, and thereby meaning existing only in our projections, right? Existing only as projection. It was talking about constructs. Okay, back in the mind-only school's interpretation of the second turning of the wheel. And when the mind-only school was explaining, oh, there are parts of the second turning of the wheel which were spoken figuratively, which were not meant literally. They were talking about changing things. And it's not true of changing things that they're only a projection of the mind. They're anything but a projection of the mind. They exist by definition. They exist from their own side, through their own unique way of being. So if you want to appreciate the first version of what it means to exist ultimately and what it means to exist deceptively, all you have to do is go back to the mind-only school's explanation of what the Buddha meant during the second turning of the wheel when he said, oh, nothing exists by definition. Okay? Nothing is.
쌤자 뭐 마탑 감각 지당 무시해 쌤자 뭐 마탑 샤오 다 본인이 우마가 되는 시 쌤자 뭐 마탑 대신들라 랑데 요아래 주담 남베 주다요 요아래 집에 주다요 요아래 니가 알아서 라신기 뭐 와서 고 가르쳐 버렸으나 쌤자 뭐 마탑 되나 뭐 와서는 쌤자 바탕 마탑 쌤자 뭐 마탑 되나 또 도대와 지다 마와 뒤주로 버트요 뒤주 가르치게 했잖아 뭐고 강강로 인주빈스 마기 여자 근데 그거는 민라 뭐고 마와 다들 뭐가 마와 줘지 엄마 줘지 아 본인은想的 내가 공부도 키우는데 엄마배 전담도 마주시야라
네.
다 거기 전담도 주시라 그거로 그러봐 전담도 주시 건설도 공부도 건설도 전담도 주시라 엄마배 공부도 전담도 주야 건설 주야 건설这이 전담도 주다 마주다 건설도 주 마주 这사고 니 된다 되는 건설당 전담기 太强多，我听了这个月子，或者你就做生习惯地嘞，我老总不清楚，你呢是现在新兵。
Now Jessica makes a further statement about that first version of what it means to exist ultimately and what it means to exist deceptively. He says further, 4 lines from the bottom on page 56, by the way, when you divide all the schools into 2, right, and how do we do that? On one hand, we have all the middle way people, okay? And then on the other hand, we have everybody from the mind-only school on down to the the sutras, the detailists, and even non-Buddhist schools, okay? And you go up to them and you divide them into 2. These people are called middle way, in this case, and everybody from the mind-only school on down, including non-Buddhist schools, are called people who profess functional things. People who talk about functional things. They're called Lupamawa, means people who profess functional things. What does it mean to be a professor of functional things? It's a blanket description of anyone who believes that a thing which performs a function should exist in truth, should exist truly. Okay? People who insist that if something can perform a function, it must exist in truth. Okay? So you can lump together all of the schools from the mind-only school on down, even including non-Buddhist schools, and say these are people who say that if something functions, if something performs a function, it must exist. It must exist in truth. Okay, so that's what people who profess functional things means. Okay, so if you divide all people into these 2 great categories, right, and these people on the one hand are going to say about produced things, they do exist ultimately. And they don't exist deceptively, right? Everybody from the mind-only school on down, even out the door into the non-Buddhists, are going to say, okay, the same thing about changing things. They're going to say those things do exist ultimately, and they do not exist deceptively. And then on the other hand are the Madhyamika people. What are they going to say? They're going to say the direct opposite. They're going to say, oh, nothing exists ultimately, and everything exists deceptively. Okay? Now, remember that we said there were going to be 2 descriptions of what it meant to exist ultimately and what it meant to exist deceptively. We have already given one of those descriptions. Okay? And it's that description which is the description you have to use when you talk about the war between this group and this group. When this group says nothing exists by definition, nothing exists ultimately, everything exists deceptively, and when this group responds and says, no, you got it backwards. Everything, all these things exist ultimately, and they don't exist deceptively. Shenwangs, right? Produce things. It is this description of what it is to exist ultimately, and it is this description of what it means to exist deceptively that forms the basis for their argument. Okay, so it's the first version of those 2 that is used to describe Shenwangs when you have a war between the middle way and everybody else about whether or not they exist deceptively and whether or not they exist ultimately. Listen. Did you get that? Looking a little blank out there. You all right? Okay. Okay. Okay.
他提往印度他们工业主，我听我说的印度工业你个对。
那是。
提往的钱呐，那怎么那么多个钱？我先比我你旁博，我先不是我你说，我你过来送来的，领导想我的说，我你说我的。那提往的钱，我先比我你旁博，他年都有是更大的，他年都有工作比几百的工作比，他们都没事。
那是。
等他们没把汤，他年都有了，等他们没把汤不讲，那叫不了大气。
那是。
我你他们你是在向往当用着你们，向往当用着你们的团他们都有，他年都没，他那不错。
And it's the same description of what it is to exist ultimately and what it is to exist nominally or deceptively that you have to use. You have to have the same idea of what those terms mean when you talk about the mind-only school's characterization of the first of their attributes as being something that exists only nominally and something that doesn't exist ultimately. Okay, you have to use that one when you think about the first of the three attributes of the mind-only school, about how they think about their own attributes. Okay, that's the one. These are the descriptions you have to use when you are describing the mind-only school's own beliefs about the three attributes. And when they say about the first attribute, which is constructs, right? Oh, these things don't exist ultimately. These things only exist nominally or deceptively. These are the connotations of the terms that they are thinking of when they say that. And when they say about the other two groups, which is what? Produced things and totality, right? When they say about those two things, these things do exist ultimately, and these things do not exist simply nominally or simply deceptively. This is the connotation of those terms that they have in mind when they say that. When they say that these latter two do exist ultimately, and they do not exist only nominally or only deceptively, they are thinking about those two terms in the sense that they have just been explained as the first version of those two terms. Listen. Listen.
적당 텐더지 적수 군속도 예바텔 적수 직당 당보 직당 텐덤도 예바텔 적수 조에 수로 거라 당보 직이에서 오 달라 두삼시네 시왕다 용도 이 텐덤도 예 소야고 단다 딜라 두삼시 군다 되니 아니 텐덤도 매 당예도 예 군속도 예시고 단다 딜라 두삼시 단도와 직시로 장로
Jetsokaba is ending the description of the first connotations, the first set of connotations for those two phrases. And he says, when the Bodhisattva levels, Arya Sangha, and when the abbreviation, Arya Sangha, when they are talking about the first of the three groups and saying that these constructs are something that do not exist ultimately, but rather do exist deceptively or nominally, this is the connotation of those two phrases that they are thinking about, the first set of connotations. Okay? And it's also this first set of connotations that they are talking about when they characterize the other two groups, the latter two groups, which is dependent things and totality or emptiness, and saying, oh, these things do exist ultimately, and they do not exist only deceptively or only in nominally. Okay, that's, again, Jetsokapa wraps up saying, this is what Arya Sangha means in those two books when he talks about something existing ultimately or something existing nominally. That's exactly what he has in mind, is the first set of connotations for those two terms.
군속도 유수를 당보가라 가르치는 것은 또배다 삼도 여박강가로 군속도 유수 당보가 송아다 되겠지. 아 또배다가 많이 봐 유랑 들르지원 죽고 적수 전담도 좀
just want to check in with you guys and make sure you got what we're talking about so far, okay? We're talking about the first way of establishing something as being ultimate and the first way of establishing something as being deceptive. And what this means is, in effect, what it means to exist ultimately and what it means to exist deceptively. Okay, that's what they're talking about, okay? And I want to check in with you and make sure that you understand that in this first presentation of the connotations of those two phrases, that when we say something does exist ultimately, what we're saying is it is not simply a construct of the mind. It is not simply a projection. Rather, it exists from its own side through its own unique way of being. And when we say, on the other hand, that something exists deceptively or something exists nominally, what we're saying is it exists only as a projection of the mind. It exists only as a creation of the mind. And it does not have the other kind of existence, okay? It doesn't have any existence of coming from its own side through its own unique way of being. And that's what the first take on what those two phrases means is, okay? We didn't get to the second take yet, okay? So we don't have to keep reading in the book. I'm not going to quote the book now. I'm going to try to give you a hands-on example of what these two are. So, question for you guys. Okay, ready for a question? When we say that we are restricting or defining, when we say that we are restricting ourselves to the first explanation of what it is to exist ultimately, right? If we say we are restricting ourselves to the first version of what it means to exist ultimately, we keep saying ultimate, 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 ultimate. What does ultimate mean? Rangi tumomi yongi dulikin ngone jupadis. Dundam to your percentage. Topi tansa mayimbas.
Oh yeah,
you said that doesn't exist only as projections. Could you elaborate on it just a bit? It seems to need a little bit of elaboration.
It doesn't exist by projections.
That usually comes in two halves, right? Right. Tope tatsa mayimba rangi tumo mayimbi dunuking ngone juba. Yes, everybody assent. Ko lamading ekles. So if you stuff your tummy, she won't have to eat.
No, I eat meat.
Not shasagyo, ko shasagyo. If we restrict ourselves to this first interpretation of what it means when we say things exist ultimately, right? And it's just what you said. It's not just a projection. The thing does exist from its own side through its own unique way of being, okay? If you describe existing ultimately that way, which is the first of the two ways, right? Then how many of those three groups, okay, the three attributes of the MindOnly school, to how many of those groups does that description apply? Which two?
Dependent things and emptiness.
That's right. Now you got the first way of establishing what it means to exist ultimately. Now you understand it. Okay. So now, again, restricting ourselves to the first way of explaining these two phrases. What does it mean for something to exist deceptively then?
It doesn't exist from its own side, it's just a projection of the mind.
Rangi tumome yembe dulika ngune madupachene tope taksa yimba yinkendila disagrees. Kunzo to you. So I guess the Venerable here can eat dinner, and you guys won't have to eat dinner because you're all one mind stream, and feed the rest of you when he eats. That's the way it is. That's the way Okay, so now that you've got it straight, what it means in the first interpretation of things for something to exist deceptively, how many of those three attributes do exist deceptively and how many don't? Yeah, you derived that from the other one, right? Is this clean now? Is this clean for everybody? Do we understand it? Is it clear? Okay. Nine.
다 빼자도 시험 되네요. 디바라 되는데 빼자고도 돼도 되는 누가 납중행아 디바라 되는 찍도 아니 하고 망고 해야 되는 님 투부도.
니그네.
또 스테이지야.
나상이.
그래 납중행에 되는 또 그냥 좀 꿈에 들어 인간 윤바되는.
나상.
쪽도 니봤다나 지도와.
납중강아.
납중행에 숨투 윤바야지.
나살라라.
쪽도 니봤다나 지도와. 소사대야
The presentation of the second interpretation of these two phrases begins on the 7th line from the bottom on page 55. Geshe-la says, look, we don't have time to go into the detail from the scripture on what the second version is. So I'm just going to consolidate it and give it to you all in one big hunk, okay? And just lay it on you. We got, a little bit of time left. I'll just extemporaneously explain to you what it is. Listen. There's a lot of other issues to bring up before we actually get to the second one, but I don't want you to get confused. I don't want you to get, to get it all mixed up. So let's just go to the second one. I'll give you a brief presentation of what it is. Listen.
조선입에 온 것은 전담도 유스에 전담지 알아봐. 대가선 동대버렸어. 용도 그. 하양dik 세대도 용도 거라 가르잖아. 다 대어 용도 거랑 생이라 남다 남기 미파. 나한테 빠지 가다 이지 바로 도토그로 와.
나니.
조선입에 온 것이 전담 세야 거라 남다 남기 미파 타도 거라. 조선입이. 남제. 다그 독조 거랑 다. 수도 줘래. 남다 남기 미파 타도 마인겐기 쉬어 걸어 조선이요.
That's very easily to present it very, very simply, okay? The meaning of the word ultimate in the second interpretation, when you say things exist ultimately or things don't exist ultimately, all it means is, all it's referring to, the ultimate here, is referring to totality, emptiness itself, okay? That's all it means there. In the second interpretation, it's just referring to totality, which means emptiness itself. Defined in this school as the ultimate object of the path of purity. Remember that expression from the beginning of the book? The ultimate object of the path of purity, meaning that thing which the direct perception of emptiness perceives. Okay, is the definition in the mind-only school of what we call totality or emptiness. Okay. And to state it very, very simply, if you want to know what deceptive means in the phrase exist deceptively or something like that, those things which are deceptive are all other things, okay? All other things. All those existing objects, he's careful to say that, right? All those existing objects which cannot be characterized as being the object of the ultimate object of the path of purity, then that would be, in the second interpretation of these two phrases, the meaning of what it is to exist deceptively, or what deceptive objects are. So now, I got my other question out for you. When we were thinking about those three attributes, or those three groups of things, according to the Mind-Only School, now, how many of them exist ultimately according to this interpretation of what it means to exist ultimately? The Chigmato Yomanes. Which one? Yongdu. Now, come on, this one's easy. Okay, so in the second way of interpreting things, how many of those three groups are what can be said to exist deceptively? That's it.
di lung de da ga du lung ta da ngai ne tang hua ya ngai so wa de ngai ta ye gi ta ta
la ni
o di de da ta chang se na la xiao chen dong de ye ji la fong a 다 라가니 나네 카라 삼라다네 랍기 사레스 셈담에.
Nothing. So now's quiz time. All right. Going back to the first interpretation of what it is. I'm sorry. Let's state it differently. Don't forget that the Bodhisattva levels by Arya Sangha. In there, he says over and over and over again that dependent things exist ultimately. He says over and over again that dependent things exist ultimately. Now, which of the two interpretations of existing ultimately is he referring to when he says that changing things exist ultimately? Joksu Dombo Deres. That Changsa Nalia, Shawan de Dunda de Yopa Serigalia, Dunda de Yopa de Joksu Dombo ki Dunda de Yopa Deres. Got that? Yep.
율레제나 전담 많이 받차도 찍체 전담 거는 다들 찍다 알고 그냥 양심에 레바나데 율레제나 전담 많이 받차도 그도 세네 시기도 와 이 전담 거 가르라 시기에서
Now we go back to those 5 groups of quotations, right, where someone's attacking the MindOnly school. And one of those quotations said, once something has come from its causes and conditions, it can no longer be said to be ultimate. Which ultimate are we talking about now? Which of the two interpretations of ultimate are we talking about now? Nipadi is. Joksu Nipadi is. Joksu Nipadi Dundam is. Gyudan Ken Rangi, okay, Rangi Gigan Keba Yena. Then Mayin here said, Digi Dundam did Joksu Nipadi Dundam is.
하체 온도다 타셈도 먹고는 로라 시원 전담도 예스 생을 삼았다 전담도 예스 카게 남나야 남가 찍고 썼지 시원 전담도 매스 남나야 남가 또 썼지 다 누굽니다.
But you know there's a problem. If you say that the people who live in the mind-only school, okay, when they talk about half the time when they talk about something exists ultimately, and they say, oh, things exist ultimately, in that case, they're referring to ultimate with one connotation. And then when they go around saying things don't exist ultimately, and in that case, they're referring to ultimate with a wholly different connotation, does that seem a little weird to you? That they're what do they call it? There's a word in English. They are, there's a technical word for that. They're changing the meaning of the word when they, on different occasions. Yeah, there's what's it called? No. Sophistry maybe or something like that. Anyway, it's to use the same word, but to mean it in 2 different ways, according to your desires. You know, I know you kind of.
Ambiguity?
Yeah, no, there's a technical word for it. Anyway, it's like sophistry or something like that. Yeah, the kensawares. But dundan the yusegi dundan chike, dundan the mayasegi dundan segi dundan yang minda chikena. That sometimes it looks around now and that's kensawares.
괜찮아요. 너무 괜찮아요 말이야. 가르스는 전담도 예스 라비 온도 샤워 전담도 예스 진짜 방법하라 싸움부터는 신선한 샤워 전담도 예스 진짜 딱딱 로트게
If a MindOnly school person comes up and says, yes, it's true that produced things do exist ultimately, then it's no problem for them to mean ultimately in the first connotation of it. Is that okay that they mean it in the first way? Is it okay to say that? In the MindOnly school. Yeah, they would say it's okay. They say that's okay. It means it's not just a production of your mind. It's not just a fabrication of your mind. It really does exist from its own side. The pen and the like that here.
What was this? 다 샤워 전담도 매스는 야 삼무스다는 자기 대라 삼무다는 없다. 코라다는 삼무 대비 대라 삼무다는 샤워 전담도 예스 랍시 말고 하나하나 삼무다는 샤워 전담도 매스는 없다. 삼무 되네 마땅하지? 샤워 전담도 야 말이지. 매서 삼무 파게 니바다라 삼무다는 샤워 전담도 매스는 야 람나 딩딩.
Now I ask you another question. Is it okay for a MindOnly person to come up and say, dependent things don't exist ultimately, if they mean that ultimate in the second sense?
English we say they don't exist as the ultimate. We wouldn't say they don't exist as ultimate.
Yeah, you can say that. You can say that. Injikeli are not that turbulent. Dundam do your stun. Dundam ru yes the kid that's here. Dundam to your said and dundam bar your said the kid that's here. Kid that's here. Not that that's here. Dundam dambar yes subject. Didn't you that that's too. Do it, not the chamber man. Nani. You're engine now than you Yeah, what you point out is the difference between is and its meaning as existing and is and its meaning as identification. And you say, I have money. No, you're saying it is not the ultimate. It has ultimateness or something like that. You see what I mean? There's between being the ultimate and having ultimate nature or something like that. Yeah. Peter Youngre, Digre. Nani.
다 된다 디기 가지고 룽아 창 시원 된다도 몇 발 수행 지금 가르쳐 상담하서는 룽아부터 되는지 룽아 되게 줄래 나 해봐
나네
어떻게 가르쳐 상담하잖아 매매매매매시 진짜 진고를 써야 돼 조조 입에 전담관을 상담 따는 게 다가라
나서
장사도 노안이에 시원 된다도 요요시 조조 입안을 상담 당겨 말했어 또 다음에 된다고 상담 당는 거 다 간지 샘다빌랭
나네 가와빵 So there we have the mind-only school's method of avoiding any accusation that they are being contradictory, right? You know, all they have to say is, hey, when I said, we know when Arya Sangha said in the Bodhisattva levels that dependent things exist ultimately, he was talking about ultimate in the first sense. Okay? And when in those other 5 quotations, they say, hey, all those things don't exist ultimately, they were talking about ultimate in the second sense. It's no problem. We don't have any of those problems that you accuse us of. And this is remember that's the name of the whole section. The name of the whole section was the way in which they avoid the apparent inconsistencies. They just, there's a word for that. What is that? It's where you change the meaning of the term halfway through your argument. And so you don't have any problems. Anyway, okay.
단데네 단다야 당연히 다 지셔 다 당연히 호랑 진짜 막 중앙시 대치 중앙시라니 양도할래 뭐가 저발라 용서 공부 민란네 나바시비 미파 솔로스비 민제지 뭐 솔로스비 단이 관계 여바티니 대단히 비 대당 전담니까야 메토 다데나 가려는데 리베야 차고시 단
차버려
뭐가 저발라 용서 공부 민란네 나바시에 바시
나네
미파 직샤
나네
미파 솔로스비 민제지 뭐 거라 민다도 됐다 단이 관계 여바티니 단이 대소야 중민도 전담도야 매소 전담니까야 매도 대다라는 솔로스비다 독마 셰두다 그래서 이 참고 다른 독세 미치라피
나서
뭐가 줘발라 용수 공비 민란네 뭐가 줘발라 용수 공비 민란네 나바시에 빠시 온들다라네 아니 똑바더라 다 가지 자고 돼 뭐가 줘발라 용수 공비 민란네 비 나바시에 빠시 뒤자 다 아니 똑바르자 뭐가 싫어 뭐가 줘발라 용수 공비 민란네 비 나바시 빠시 어디 똑바더라
나서
나가 쉐바 코치안에 그 미파 나 미파스도 잡배나 수샤나
나네
뭐고 수라지 뭐 봐줘봐 나 마시 미파 수라 소 마이스 코라 수고 근데 미파에 수고나 민고나 수 민제스라 다 수라서 민제스 수지 민제스 뭐 근데 수지 민감잖아 뭐보라 민제 기 뭐보라 진짜 미파 코라 뭐보라 수라 소비 다니 관계 여바티니 다니 디 제다 전담니까야 메토스 다 dum되버셔다 되나 똑바지샤 콜라나에 콜라가 삼모 코에 거기 유지샤 유지샤
숙제
근데 유코 아니 제소야 민도 담도야 미독스래 얘들아 다 텐데 미파 넘버 15 델랩송아 넘버 15 용수 공부 넘버 15 넘버 15 델랩으로 그 미파 파게 치버와 한다 코로나 나는 신을 수우스야 다 수우마리 뼈 알았어 민제를 저거로 수우지 민담지만 그래도 애들 수우마지 뭐 텐데 코스라 대 제수양 주민도스 제유장 말에 담도야 네 담도야 네
Geshe is going back to a really, I think we promised to go back to this earlier. It's page 54, second line. I think we might have made a mark there. He said this wording is really nasty, okay? And it really is. What the wording means literally in English is that consciousness which remains in a state of where it has accustomed itself to, it has thoroughly accustomed itself to names according to the expression, okay? Something like that, like almost like gibberish, like it doesn't make any sense. Geshe says, hey look, just take that whole section, just take that whole line and a half, second line to the third line of page 54, and all that's referring to is the constructing state of mind, okay? The mind which is projection, making a projection, or the mind which is making a construction, a construct, okay? Take it like that. And then in the following line it says, let's talk about its object, the object which this state of mind is focusing on, okay? And then it says, that object is that thing, that physical form, that visible form. This said is suktigi, migi number shabi is sukchedire sukchedandire. Nasa. Oh, kundadire, nasa. Nasa. Then it says that thing which is called form, which possesses the name, that form which possesses the name of form. Okay. Then it says that form which possesses the name of form. That object, which is it? That form which is the thing which possesses the name form. How's that? Okay. And it says, let's talk about that. That particular thing, which acts as the object of that particular state of mind, neither exists substantially, neither does it exist ultimately. Okay. Having said that, when the book, Dua, right, the abbreviation, says about anything, that thing which neither exists substantially nor exists ultimately, they must be talking about constructs, okay? They must be talking about constructs, okay? They don't exist substantially and they don't exist ultimately. They must be talking about constructs. Therefore you can assume, says Geshe, that when they talk about the object of the mind here, they're not talking about physical matter or form in the sense of a shenwang, in the sense of a dependent thing. They must be talking about the object it thinks it sees, as opposed to the object it's focused upon. Okay, the object it thinks it sees is gundan. Okay, is constructs. So when they go through this very difficult wording, and they're talking about that form, which is the thing which is given the name form, Geshe says this is so arcane. The wording here is so obscure that I'm not even sure we can take it to mean constructs in the traditional sense of the meaning of the term constructs. It must be talking about something, that's close to a construct. It doesn't seem to be saying quite construct. It seems to be saying even something, a little bit of a variation on a construct. Okay, that's what I mean.
대단 가서 대단은 된도 민지 술로서 민지 다니까 여바텐 다니 대다 된답니까야 매도 대단은 술로서 민지기 최 대단 원이 여바 많이 발래 이 꾸다바 강이 바텐 답이 여바 이바를 봐서나 다 여기도 두들 대요 많이 다요
So whatever this object is, okay? We're not talking about the actual object of the eye consciousness, right? We're not talking about the thing that you're looking at. We're talking about something that you think you see, right? And it's getting close to a construct, right? It seems to be a variant on a construct. And then it says further, this thing does not exist substantially, and this thing does not exist ultimately. So what it's saying in effect is, and the following line stated, what it's implying then is that since the thing doesn't exist ultimately, it must exist. I'm sorry, it doesn't exist substantially. It must exist as a labeled thing. Remember the distinction we had between existing substantially and existing as a labeled thing? So I guess you got to throw this object, whatever it is, right? This almost construct. You have to throw it in the category of labeled things, first of all. Secondly, because it's said not to exist ultimately, you're going to have to throw it into the category of things called deceptive objects, deceptive things. Okay? So there's two things we can say about this object, whatever it is. It doesn't exist